As we saw with the release of the first 2020 census data several months ago, the total population of the United States on April 1, 2020 was 331.4 million, an increase of 22.7 million from 2010. This graph shows population change for the United States by decade for the past century. The bars show the numeric change in population by decade. The black line shows the percentage change by decade. Since the 1950s, percentage increases have generally been declining each decade. This past decade's 7.4% increase was lower than the previous decade's 9.7% increase and was, in fact, the second lowest percent increase ever. Only the 1930s had slower growth. This slowdown in growth is evident if you look at population change at the state level for the past 3 decades. This slide and the next 2 slides will show how state populations have changed for the past 3 decades. Here we see a map of population change for the states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico for the decade 1990 to 2000. The 4 census regions are also outlined on the map. Those areas in the darkest shade had growth of 10% or more for the decade. Those in the lightest shade had growth of 0 to 4.9%. Areas shaded in orange had population decline. The country grew by a relatively robust 13.2% in the 1990s. All 50 states increased in population that decade, as did Puerto Rico. Only the District of Columbia lost population during the 1990s. States growing by 10% or more that decade were almost all in the South or West. Here we see the equivalent map for 2000 to 2010 with the same categories. From 2000 to 2010, the fastest growing states were located in either the West or the South. During this decade, 49 states and the District of Columbia grew, with Michigan and Puerto Rico declining in population. We see fewer states growing by 10% or more, and no states in the Northeast or Midwest growing that rapidly. We also see more states in the 0 to 4.9% category. And finally, here is the map for 2010 to 2020. The slowdown in population growth this past decade is evident. There are fewer states in the highest growth category, more states growing slowly, and 3 states, West Virginia, Mississippi, and Illinois, along with Puerto Rico, declined in population. Most states in the West continue to be in the fastest growth category, but this is no longer true in the South. In that region, only 5 states and the District of Columbia were in the fastest growing category, whereas 6 states in the South had moderate growth, 3 were in the slowest growth, and 2 had population decline. In all 3 decades, the fastest growing states have tended to be in the South or West, with generally slower growth for states in the Northeast and Midwest. A notable exception is North Dakota this past decade, which was up 15.8% and one of the fastest growing states. I'll replay the 3 decades again so that you can see the changes over time. Now let's look at counties. We'll start with this map showing population density for counties in the 2020 census. The counties shaded darkest on this map have population densities of 1,000 or more people per square mile. Those in the lightest shade have densities of less than 50 persons per square mile. This map is a reminder that the U.S. population continues to be very unevenly distributed across the land area, with high population densities in the Northeast corridor from Boston to Washington, D.C., in large metropolitan areas nationwide, and in parts of Puerto Rico. Low population densities are common in the western half of the country and in Alaska. This next set of maps will look at population change by decade for counties in the United States and Puerto Rico. With the redistricting data released today, we see that the slowdown in growth over the past 3 decades is even more pronounced at the county level than for states. I'll show maps for the last 3 decades, all with the same classes, so you can easily see how patterns have changed over time. This first map shows percent change in population between 1990 and 2000 for counties. Those counties shaded in dark green grew by 20% or more, which was well above the 13.2% increase nationally for that decade. Those counties shaded orange, on the other hand, had population decline. In the 1990s, most counties had population growth, and many were in the 20% or more category. There were a number of counties that lost population that decade. Most counties declining in population were located in the Great Plains region of the country's midsection, along with parts of Appalachia, interior parts of the Northeast, and the Mississippi Delta. Moving ahead to the 2000 to 2010 decade, population decline, those counties shaded in orange, became somewhat more extensive. And whereas growth in the 1990s was often widespread across regions, in the 2000 to 2010 decade, we start to see growth mainly occurring in metro areas. Most of the counties growing by 20% or more that decade were in the South or West, and often were the outer counties of moderately or fast-growing metropolitan areas such as Atlanta, Dallas-Fort Worth, or Minneapolis-St. Paul. We now turn to the 2010 to 2020 decade. Population decline is even more widespread this decade, with 52% of all counties having smaller populations in 2020 than in 2010. Metro areas are even more prominent this decade as the locations of population growth amidst otherwise widespread population decline. Texas is a good example of this, where parts of the Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas-Fort Worth, Midland, and Odessa metro areas had population growth, whereas many of the state's other counties had population declines. Rapid growth also occurred in parts of western North Dakota. McKenzie County, North Dakota, was the country's fastest growing county this decade, increasing a whopping 131% between 2010 and 2020. Nearby Williams County, North Dakota, grew by 83%. I'll replay the 3 decades again so that you can see the changes over time. When we look more closely at the patterns of population increase and decrease for counties this past decade, we see a strong relationship to population size, with small counties tending to lose population and more populous counties tending to gain people. This bar chart shows it in more detail. The graphic shows percent change in population this past decade by county population size in 2010. The 4 smallest size categories all experienced population decline this decade. Counties with populations under 1,000 in 2010, for example, lost 4.4% of their population during the decade. Counties with 1 to 5,000 people, 5 to 10,000 people, and 10 to 50,000 people also lost people this decade on average. Only 2 categories of counties showed growth. Counties with between 50 and 100,000 people grew by 4.1%, while counties with 100,000 or more people grew by 9.1%. Now let's look at population change over time for metropolitan areas. Metro areas are collections of 1 or more counties that have an urban core of at least 50,000 people and adjacent territory with close economic and social ties to that core. During the 1990s, some of the fastest growing metro areas were in the South and the interior West, while some metro areas in upstate New York, western Pennsylvania, and parts of the Midwest lost population. And here we see the pattern for 2000 to 2010. Compared to the prior decade, fewer metro areas grew by 20% or more, and more metro areas declined in population. Most metro areas in Puerto Rico lost population that decade. And here's the map for 2010 to 2020. We see even fewer metro areas with growth of 20% or more, and more metro areas declining in population. Indeed, metro areas with population decline are now found in all 4 regions, and many states have metro areas with population gains, as well as those with population declines. All of the metro and micro areas in Puerto Rico lost population this decade. The Villages, Florida, was the country's fastest growing metro area this decade, up 39% from 2010. I'll replay the 3 decades again so you can see the changes over time. As a result of the patterns of population change seen in the prior maps, the country's population is increasingly metropolitan. This graphic shows the shares of the U.S. population in core-based statistical areas, the collective term for metro and micro areas, as well as outside CBSA, that is, population not in a metro or micro area. In 2000, 84.3% of the U.S. population was in a metro area. That's the light green section of the graphic on the left. By 2020, the proportion of the U.S. population in metro areas increased to 86.3%, while it decreased in both micro areas and in areas outside of metro and micro areas. Finally, let's look briefly at some 2020 census results for cities. This table shows the 10 largest cities in 2020 and their populations and population change for the past 2 decades. The 10 largest cities all grew this past decade, and 8 of the 10 grew at a faster rate this decade compared to the last. The fastest growing of these large cities was Phoenix, whose population increased by 11.2% this decade. The 10 largest cities in 2020 are the same group as in 2010, but the rankings changed slightly. Phoenix moved up from 6th to 5th largest city and traded spots with Philadelphia, which moved down from 5th to 6th. For the first time ever in a decennial census, all 10 of the largest cities in the United States now have more than 1 million people. This map shows the 14 cities with population gains of 100,000 or more this decade. 12 were located in the South or West, with 1 each in the Northeast and Midwest. The cities with the largest population gains this decade were New York, up more than 600,000, and Houston, up just over 200,000. This map shows the 10 fastest growing cities in percentage terms this decade, among those that had at least 50,000 people in 2010. The map shows those 10 fastest growing cities as red dots, and it labels their nearest large city as a green dot. As you can see, these fast-growing cities are generally suburbs of nearby larger cities. So in other words, Frisco and McKinney, Texas are both fast-growing cities near Dallas, and Kent, Washington is a fast-growing suburb of Seattle. All 10 of these cities grew by at least 44%, and the fastest-growing one, Buckeye, Arizona, a western suburb of Phoenix, was up nearly 80% this decade to reach over 91,000 in population. In summary, U.S. population growth slowed this decade. Only the 1930s had slower growth. Fewer states, metro areas, and counties had rapid population growth this decade. Population decline was widespread this decade. Most counties lost population between 2010 and 2020. On average, smaller counties tended to lose population, and more populous counties tended to grow. Population growth this decade was almost entirely in metro areas. Metro areas grew by 8.7%, and micro areas grew by 0.8%. Population in territory not in a metro or micro area declined by 2.8%. All 10 of the country's most populous cities grew this decade. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Nicholas Jones, who will discuss some of the broader 2020 census findings for race and ethnicity.
Thank you, Mark. That was really great information about how areas across the nation are changing. Good afternoon. I'm Nicholas Jones, the Director of Race, Ethnicity Research and Outreach for the Census Bureau's Population Division. I am honored to be here and excited to share highlights on 2020 census statistics for race and ethnicity. Mark and I would both like to thank all of the dedicated census staff and especially our colleagues in Population Division for the months and months of work undertaken during the pandemic to process, code, review, and analyze the 2020 data. Census Bureau experts have worked tirelessly to prepare this new information for the American public. You entrusted us with this data, and it is our duty to return it back to you, the people of the United States. Today's release of 2020 census data provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition and the racial and ethnic diversity of our nation. To help state officials, researchers, media, and the public examine the redistricting statistics for your state and county as well as other areas across the country. We just released 2 America Counts stories on our website. Together, the stories provide a new snapshot of our nation's population and how interconnected we are. It's important to frame the 2020 census data historically, as the U.S. Census Bureau has collected data on race since the first census in 1790 and data on Hispanic or Latino origin since the 1970 census. How the concepts of race and ethnicity are measured and how the statistics are collected and coded has changed every decade. These changes reflected social, political, and economic factors throughout our nation's history. You can explore the new data viz on our website, census.gov. The 2020 census data enable us to understand how the racial and ethnic composition and the racial and ethnic diversity of the United States population looked in 2020. Before we present the results, it's important to note that the U.S. Census Bureau collects race and ethnicity data in accordance with the 1997 standards for maintaining, collecting, and presenting federal data on race and ethnicity, directed by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. Therefore, the designs of the 2020 census questions on Hispanic origin and race are similar to the designs used in the 2000 census and the 2010 census. While the Census Bureau tested an alternative question design in 2015, we must ultimately follow the 1997 OMB standards and use 2 separate questions to collect data on race and on ethnicity. Our testing, however, did show that we could make improvements to the 2020 census race and ethnicity questions within the OMB guidelines. Building on our extensive research and outreach last decade, we made several improvements to the questions for 2020. I encourage you to check out our recent webinar and blog to learn more. We improved the ways we process the data and code the responses to these questions. This work began in 2015 with our research and testing centered on findings from the 2015 National Content Test, and the designs were implemented in the 2018 census test. The improvements and changes enable a more thorough and accurate depiction of how people self-identify, yielding a more accurate portrait of how people report their Hispanic origin and their race within the context of a 2-question format. These changes reveal that the U.S. population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past. We are confident that differences in the overall racial distributions are largely due to improvements in the design of the 2 separate questions for race data collection and processing, as well as some demographic changes over the past 10 years. We are also confident, as shown in our research over the past decade, that using a single combined question for race and ethnicity in the decennial census would ultimately yield an even more accurate portrait of how the U.S. population self-identifies, especially for people who self-identify as multiracial or multi-ethnic. The 2020 census illuminates the racial and ethnic composition of the United States. The first component of this composition, for ethnicity statistics, comes from the question on Hispanic or Latino origin. From these data, we know that the Hispanic or Latino population numbered 62.1 million in 2020. The second component of this composition, for racial statistics, comes from a separate question on race. To frame the discussion of racial composition, we use the concepts of race alone, race in combination, and race alone or in combination. These concepts have been in place since the 2000 census, and the 3 concepts are central to understanding our country's changing demographics. Today's release of 2020 census statistics provides a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition of the country. The white population remains the largest race or ethnicity group in the United States, with 204.3 million people identifying as white alone and 235.4 million people identifying as white alone or in combination with another race group. The 2 or more races population, also referred to as the multiracial population, was measured at 33.8 million people in 2020. The sum of the race alone or in combination population at 49.9 million surpassed the Black or African American population, which was 46.9 million, as the second largest race alone or in combination group. The next largest racial populations were the Asian alone or in combination group with 24 million people, the American Indian and Alaska Native alone or in combination group with 9.7 million people, and the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander alone or in combination group with 1.6 million people. In the 2020 census, for all race groups, their in-combination multiracial populations accounted for most of the overall changes in each racial category. Although the white alone population decreased by 8.6% since 2010, the white in-combination population saw a 316% change during the same period. While the Black or African American alone population grew 5.6% since 2010, the Black or African American in combination population grew 88.7%. Over the past 10 years, the American Indian and Alaska Native in combination population increased by 160%. The Asian alone population grew by 35.5% between 2010 and 2020. In comparison, the Asian in combination population grew 55.5% since 2010. The Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander alone population grew by 27.8% between 2010 and 2020. In comparison, the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander in combination population grew faster at 30.8% since 2010. The some other race in combination population changed 733% since 2010. It is important to note that these comparisons between the 2020 census and 2010 census race data should be made with caution, taking into account the improvements we have made to the Hispanic origin and race questions, data processing, and the ways we code what people tell us. Accordingly, data from the 2020 census showed different but reasonable and expected distributions from the 2010 census for the white alone population, the sum of the race alone or in combination population, and the multiracial population, especially for people who self-identify as both white and some other race. The largest multiracial combinations in 2020 were white and some other race at 19.3 million, white and American Indian and Alaska Native with 4 million, white and Black or African American at 3.1 million, white and Asian at 2.7 million, and Black or African American and some other race with 1 million. Another way to examine data on race and ethnicity is to cross-tabulate Hispanic or Latino origin by race. This was done for Census 2000 and the 2010 census, as well as the 2020 census redistricting tables. Table P2 provides cross-tabulated Hispanic origin by race statistics. To illustrate the results from the cross-tabulation of Hispanic origin by race data, this graphic compares percent change in racial identification among the Hispanic or Latino population, shown on the left, and the percent change among non-Hispanics on the right. The number of people of Hispanic or Latino origin who identified as white alone decreased by 52.9%, down from 26.7 million to 12.6 million over the 10-year period. Between 2010 and 2020, the number of people of Hispanic or Latino origin reporting more than one race increased from 3 million, 6%, to 20.3 million, 32.7%, a 567% change. We describe the results in our America Counts story with an overview of race and ethnicity in the United States. Again, these results are not surprising as they align with our expert research and corresponding findings this past decade about the impacts of the decennial census question format on race and ethnicity reporting. These improvements more accurately illustrate the richness and complexity of how people self-identify their race and ethnicity in response to two separate questions within the current OMB standards. In a companion America Counts story that we released today, we illustrate how the 2020 census results allow us to measure the nation's racial and ethnic diversity and how it varies at different geographic levels. we explore multiple measures of racial and ethnic diversity. For these measures, we cross-tabulate the race and Hispanic origin statistics as data users often do, such as with the 2020 Census redistricting tables. Here we see results that are not as impacted by the race reporting patterns of Hispanic or Latino respondents. Thus, we are confident that the changes we are seeing from 2010 to 2020 in the diversity measures, which calculate mutually exclusive Hispanic origin by race groups, likely reflect actual demographic changes in the population over the past 10 years, as well as improvements to the question designs, data processing, and coding. Another way to understand the results from the 2020 census is to see how all racial and ethnic groups are distributed across the country to inform our understanding of diversity. Some people have different perceptions of what it means for a population to be diverse. Our definition for diversity refers to the representation and relative size of different racial and ethnic groups within a population. Diversity is maximized when all groups are represented in an area and have equal shares of the population. We are using several approaches to measure the racial and ethnic diversity of the U.S. population. These include the Diversity Index, prevalence rankings and the diffusion score, and a series of prevalence maps. To help set the stage, we first present a state-level map using data from the 2010 census. The map shows the geographic distribution of the Diversity Index across the country from state to state. The states shown in dark green were more diverse, with a Diversity Index score of 65.0 or more in 2010. States shown in light green were less diverse in 2010. Now we have a map calculating the Diversity Index for the 2020 census. In 2020, at the national level, there was a 61.1% chance that two people, chosen at random, were from different race and ethnicity groups. This is higher than in 2010, when the Diversity Index was 54.9%. In general, the states with the highest Diversity Index scores in the 2020 census are found in the West, Hawaii, California, and Nevada, in the South, Maryland and Texas, along with the District of Columbia, a state equivalent, and in the Northeast, New York and New Jersey. In 2020, Hawaii had the highest diversity index at 76.0%, followed by California with 69.7% and Nevada with 68.8%. You can see the diversity index for all states using our interactive Tableau data visualization on diversity that we released today on our census.gov website. The next measure of diversity that I will present are prevalence ranking graphs. These graphics show the percentage of the population that falls into the largest race or ethnic group, the second largest race or ethnic group, and the third largest race or ethnic group. In this graphic, the colors of the bars represent the different racial and ethnic groups shown in the legend. Looking at the orange bars in column 1, we see the white alone non-Hispanic population was the most prevalent racial or ethnic group for all states except California, Hawaii, New Mexico, and the District of Columbia, a state equivalent, as well as Puerto Rico. In 2020, the Hispanic or Latino population became the largest racial or ethnic group in California, comprising 39.4% of the total population, up from 37.6% in 2010. In 2020, we also saw shifts in the second most prevalent group for some states. These are shown in the second column of the graphic. In West Virginia, the multiracial non-Hispanic population, 4.0%, became the second most prevalent group. In Wisconsin, the Hispanic or Latino population, 7.6%, became the second most prevalent group. In Texas, the first and second most prevalent group rankings did not change between 2010 and 2020, but the difference in size between the white alone non-Hispanic population and the Hispanic or Latino population shrank to about 0.5%. For the District of Columbia, the difference in the size of the Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population and the white alone non-Hispanic population narrowed dramatically in 2020 to only a 2.9 percentage point difference, down from 15.2 percentage points 10 years ago. As another diversity measure, we also present the diffusion score. This diffusion score measures the percentage of the population that is not in the first, second, or third largest race and ethnic groups combined. This measure tells us how diverse and unconcentrated the population is relative to the largest groups. 2020 census results show that Hawaii was the state with the highest diffusion score at 21.8%, followed by Alaska at 17.9%, Oklahoma at 17.8%, and Nevada at 16.0%. Another measure that we use is a series of prevalence maps to show geographic distributions and patterns in racial and ethnic diversity across the country. The first map shows the most prevalent race or ethnicity group by county for 2020. In 2020, the white-alone non-Hispanic population, shown in orange, was the largest group in about 90% of counties. The Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population, shown in blue, was the largest group in some counties in the South. The Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, was the most prevalent group in counties in the Southwest and West. In addition, the American Indian and Alaska Native alone non-Hispanic population, shown in purple, was the largest racial or ethnic group in counties in Alaska, the Four Corners region, and the Upper Great Plains. There's more variation in the map for the second most prevalent racial or ethnic group. Here we see racial or ethnic groups are represented in patterns are not as tightly clustered as they were in specific regions in the first most prevalent group. Often these show an inverse relationship to the most prevalent group map. The Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, was the second most prevalent group and spanned the entire continental United States, with large numbers of counties in every region. The multiracial non-Hispanic population, shown in teal, was the second most prevalent group in many counties throughout the northern part of the country, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. As the country has grown, we've continued to evolve in how we measure the race and ethnicity of the people who live here. The improvements we made to the 2020 census yield a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify in response to two separate questions on Hispanic origin and race. Our analysis of the 2020 census results show that the U.S. population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past. We encourage you to use our data visualizations to explore the interactive maps and graphics which illustrate the 2020 results in comparison to 2010. These multiple measures of composition and diversity complement the 2020 census redistricting data release. These are really amazing resources, and we hope you enjoy exploring them, as the data enable us to explore the richness and complexity of our nation's population in a new light. Thank you for joining us today,